Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Paideia Institute online lecture series. It is my great pleasure today to introduce Abigail Palmer. Abigail Palmer received her BA in Classics from the University of Dallas and her MA in Classics from Fordham University. She is a member of Eta Sigma Phi and Phi Beta Kappa and holds a certificate from Association Montessori Internationale for the adolescent level of instruction. Over the years, she has written classical curriculum for the high school level and published essays on a variety of topics. This spring, she published her first novel, Phelan and the Miracle Machines, an historical fiction work set in ancient Alexandria, Egypt. Abigail has taught subjects ranging from Latin and Greek to history and drama in private schools for 17 years, working with students aged 12 through 18. She lives in the Napa Valley with her husband and family. Please take it away, Abigail.
Great. Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak today. And first, I'd like to talk about my own background a little bit, like you said, in the context of my talk. So then in my talk, I'd like to discuss how I've come to discover practices in teaching that I think have been effective, both for my students and for myself. And finally, I'll talk about how teaching through story helped lead me to write my first novel, Phelan and the Miracle Machines. And I'll conclude with a kind of, it's like an encomium of Alexandria, and by extension, the study of the classical world, why that's important, why it's admirable. So I've got a lot of horses I'm trying to harness to my chariot here, and I hope I'm successful. So I first began studying Latin in the summer after 6th grade, so I'm starting with the story, right? It's a short one, though. My father sat me down with Henley Latin, which was the book that he used when he was a student, and told me it was time to learn Latin. And so I was a pretty unwilling student, and by pretty unwilling, I mean that after a few chapters of Henley, I took an old sock and I wrote Latin on it and did 2 X's for the eyes and a mouth with the tongue hanging out. And I tied a string around its neck, the neck of the sock, and I hung it from my sister and I's bunk bed. I'm done, right? So, when I have the occasional student who says they hate Latin, I'm like, huh, oh, do you? Really? Well, though I rarely tell students that story. I have told it a few times to students who are just like dead set against it. They're like, you really did that? So yeah, I got in a lot of trouble. And I really did like Latin, though. I just didn't want to spend my preteen summer studying it with my dad. So, and you probably figured out that I also like to tell stories. It's something I'll get to later in this talk. So I ended up studying Latin all through high school. I went to a large public high school that could offer it all 4 years. And then in college, I added Greek. And the more I studied of both, the more enthralled I was with them. Homer and Herodotus were my favorites as an undergraduate, and then, of course, Virgil. And then my senior year, I was fortunate enough to take a course on Augustine and really enjoyed his Latin. I found his Latin really beautiful. And after I graduated with my undergraduate degree, I taught in a classical school for a few years, all the Latin and Greek there, as well as ancient history and literature. And I think you know how it goes with, smaller private schools. They're like, oh, you're directing the play and you're going to, be the PE sub and things like that. So that was my first experience teaching. I went back to school and received my MA. And then after that, I actually didn't return to the classroom right away. I worked for a classical great books homeschool company writing curriculum for them. So I worked on that project, and then a Montessori school in the town where we live, after many years of consideration, was expanding into an adolescent program and wanted to include Latin in the curriculum. And I was available, and I was thinking I would like to get back in the classroom. And so I've been there ever since. So that was 15 years ago. I've also taught the occasional online high school Greek or Roman history class, a great books-based one. So that's my experience. So online, in-person instruction, curriculum development for ages ranging from 12 through 18. So I have some idea also of the challenges facing humanities and language programs, Latin language programs, and teachers. I look at my own high school Latin program, and it's gone. So that was, the biggest public high school in the state where I lived, and it doesn't have Latin anymore. Yeah, so there's this larger challenge in the humanities and classical languages, but I don't want to talk about that today. I want to talk about the challenges to the individual teacher. Um, so if a teacher is part of a program where every student or nearly every student studies Latin, ancient literature, and ancient history, then the task for the teacher is, of course, to engage all of these students in these subjects. And we all know it's easy to teach students who love languages and history, right? Like that's not, you know, that's not where you grow necessarily as a teacher. It's very rewarding, but that's not where you are challenged. Um, but we test our mettle when we have students who view these subjects as boring or irrelevant. For my first few years of teaching high school when I was at the classical school, I approached my history courses in what I suppose I would call a traditional way, right? I give students information in a lecture format. I expected them to assimilate the information, take notes, discuss it in review at the next class, eventually, be take an exam on it and write an essay on the material. The students who already liked history did really well. Of course, those who didn't did not. So that method is not effective. It was not effective. You're always kind of trying to pull along the ones who are resistant. It's a method that appeals to students who already have a pretty high level of academic functioning. So let's say they're not so great at taking notes, like getting the auditory input and figuring out what's important, but they like history. Well, you leave them behind too, right? Because you have this way of teaching the class and it doesn't work with their brain or it doesn't work with their skill level. So when I received this job offer to teach at the Montessori school, part of the requirement was that I go and get the adolescent training. And so I did the summer before I started teaching there. So once I completed that training, I experienced a different way to approach instruction in the humanities. So previous to my training, I had no Montessori experience. I know there's many out there, maybe some in the audience who maybe attended a Montessori school, have children who do attend Montessori school, have taught in a Montessori school before at the lower grades. So lower grades, I mean primary, which is ages 3 to 6, or elementary, which is about, ages 7 through 12. So many people go through a Montessori school, through elementary, and there are more and more options for adolescents in Montessori, but commonly you'll see someone go to a traditional junior high school and then a traditional high school after elementary. So I was not familiar with the curriculum for elementary, and I didn't know about the 5 great stories, which for the elementary students in a Montessori classroom serve as their introduction to a particular era in natural and human history. So there is, for example, one of the 5 great stories, which actually breaks down into smaller stories, is the great story of writing, which a teacher tells from memory, with materials to assist him or her. All right. And I've observed in my adolescent students that they remembered these stories, because when I asked them a year or two later in our ancient history humanities course how the Greeks developed their alphabet, like where did the Greeks get their alphabet from, they would be able to tell me that they got it from the Phoenicians. And they could tell me why the Phoenicians were such a presence in the Mediterranean world. That particular part of the great story of writing is called the story of the ox and the house. And I thought, well, that's pretty good, because I think it helps when you're working with adolescents to keep in mind adolescent brain development. And there's a great rewiring that happens to the adolescent brain. They maybe have trouble with recall. They maybe have trouble with impulse control sometimes. A lot of it, their brain is going through, I would say, I'm not a neuropsychologist, but it's like the furniture is being rearranged, right? So they're going to be learning in different ways, and they might not remember things that they have learned before, just because of the tremendous brain development that's happening. So I thought, well, this is interesting that they might not remember other things, but they remember these great stories. And elementary students hear these same lessons year after year as they're presented to the students who are younger than they are or older than they are, until as a sixth grader, we would say, or a sixth year, they have potentially heard the great stories 5 or 6 times, directly presented to them, but also going on in the background. They come to know them by heart, and a lot of times they couldn't. I heard 2 students in my Latin class at the end of class talking about this one timeline lesson, timeline of human history. Um, how much of the world existed before humans came along, right? This particular lesson, that part. Um, and they can recite those parts even as adolescents. So the educator I've discovered, who has most advanced the idea of storytelling in the classroom in the Montessori world, and for me, is Michael Dorer. So he's since passed away, but his book, The Deep Well of Time, The Transformative Power of Storytelling in the Classroom, is available for purchase. You can get it online. He also they've posted some training videos or some talks and lectures on YouTube. So if you do watch his talks, I'd recommend the one called The Power of Storytelling as a place to start. So I never got to meet him. I'm definitely not the pioneer in storytelling for the humanities as a way to convey information. I really owe a lot to him. But this was a new way of teaching a unit of the humanities, but it didn't directly apply to teaching ages 12 and up. So I don't teach elementary school. So it was interesting for me to learn how that works, but it didn't directly apply to adolescents. Then I learned about the Keepers of Alexandria program. So this is a history, culture, and Latin language curriculum that is centered on the city of Alexandria in Egypt. It was pioneered by Dr. John Wyatt, someone I think that the Paideia Institute would find aligned with their educational outreach, because starting in the late 1980s, Dr. Wyatt, who's a classics professor, developed a program for students in South Beloit public schools. He was introducing Latin and classical humanities to students who would not normally have access to these subjects. And he intentionally chose the setting of Alexandria because it was a city where all the peoples of the world came to learn, right, or to trade. So students were bound to find someone in that story who resonated with them. I did get to meet John Wyatt at the first year of my teaching at the Montessori school. I attended a conference where you did a training in the Keepers of Alexandria, the story, the materials, things like that. And he was able to attend, though he had cancer. He's since passed away, but he was a really lovely man. And when I talked to him and said, I'm a Latin teacher, he looked at me and he said, "You must hate what I'm doing." And I said, "Well, no, I don't hate it." But he said, because it wasn't like traditional grammar Latin that he was doing. So he was also pioneering Latin through story, it's a more of a mainstream idea now for Latin teachers, right? You have novellas, which of course I use in the classroom, and even something like Cambridge Latin, where you're basically teaching through a story that grows. You don't just give the student the first declension on day 1 on the first page of chapter 1 and say, "Here you go." So he was pioneering in a lot of ways. He was responding to the students he had and what he saw were their needs. His program was developed by AMI, Association Montessori International, as a unit you can use for sixth graders, so for the 12-year-olds. The Keepers of Alexandria begins with a great story. This great story is read, though. I don't have the great story memorized. It would be great to get to the point, but it has a story that goes with it with pictures. So not all the great stories in this case are memorized and or recite or told from memory. I can't say recited because when you tell a story, it's different every time, right? But you have an idea of what you want to say. So this great story you actually can read, but it's not a textbook, right? So it's not like you have an ancient history textbook and you're starting on chapter 1 and you're working through it with them and trying to bring it to life. It's not a textbook. There are materials, but so for example, This is how the Keepers of Alexandria describes the founding of the city by Alexander the Great. So this is a way that it tells this particular era in Alexandria's history. So Alexander the Great has just defeated King Darius of Persia, right? So that's the background. The 20-year-old Alexander of Macedon on a faraway field fought and defeated the Persian king Darius. In a previous war, Darius had made the Egyptians and their land his subjects. With the defeat of Darius, Alexander, who always inclined his head a little to the left upon noticing anything new, became master of Egypt. Soon he set his mind on building a new capital for his Western empire, but he was not decided where the city might be. Late one evening in the fall of 332 BC, as Alexander slept in his tent, he dreamed a dream. In the dream, the blind Homer appeared to him and whispered a verse. An island lies where loud the surf roars. Pharos, they call it, on the Egyptian shore. Alexander rose from his sleep, mounted his wild horse Bucephalus, an animal with a great black spotted head, and went straight away to the place called Rakotis, opposite the island of Pharos. And so it goes on from there. If you are familiar with this story, Alexander marks out the lines of the streets with his sword and with grain, and then birds come and swoop down and take the grain, and he thinks this is a bad sign, a bad omen, but he consults the priests and they say no. He goes off to fight in the east and of course never returns. So the rest of the program goes along in this way, in a storytelling format. And there's dates and there's people and places. You can always timeline. I think that's helpful for students, but the dates aren't overwhelming. There's not dates all over the place that they have to memorize. And I found that teaching this course in the 6th grade, my adolescents remember the stories from that too. It's a colorful city with a lot of colorful individuals. So for example, they'll say, Mrs. Palmer, remember in Alexandria when Mark Antony and Cleopatra would dress up and disguise and go out in the streets of Alexandria at night and peek their heads in at people and scare them. And so they'll remember these details, or, details of the Ptolemies. And the Alexandria course, it goes from basically where I just told the story of Alexander and his dream, all the way until the earthquake in the 1300s. That brings down the lighthouse. And so to the end of ancient Alexandria and medieval Alexandria. So it goes through the Ptolemies, the Romans, the Byzantines, Persian control, Muslim control, the back and forth between the Byzantines, Muslims, and Persians, and then its eventual decline as Cairo begins to grow as a city and Alexandria kind of wanes as an ancient city. So it's a lot of time that this course is covering, but it doesn't feel like it. We talk about its whole history over a couple classes, and my students stay pretty engaged. So that helps with the 12-year-olds, right? So it's really not meant for grades 7 through 12, so for junior high and high school. So I've been working for years to incorporate storytelling into as much of my ancient Greek and Roman humanities classes that I teach at those levels as possible. So it is a method that works for grades 7 to 12 to gain the attention of the students and to give them a way to understand whole abstract ideas with one concrete and memorable illustration of them. So there's, Michael Dorer talked about this idea of holism, right? You can spend 15 minutes talking about a concept, or you can tell one story in 5 minutes, maybe, that will stay with them and conveys the idea of that concept, the main idea of it. So how do you make this work for high school, for example? So for my ancient, we have what we call integrated humanities. So it's for all of our history and literature, equal parts literature and history together, and they go along. So our high schoolers just finished their American integrated humanities. So they read, works of fiction in their literature class while they're studying the history at the same time. Their time is equally divided between those two. So we go on cycles of what history courses we offer. It's still a pretty small high school. We have added a grade as the years go by, and but for my ancient integrated humanities class, we read the Iliad, the whole thing, right? So hand out the books. Don't open the books though, and I'll begin with the story, right? So once there was a beautiful sea nymph, Thetis. She was not only beautiful, but she was good. When the gods needed her assistance, she always offered it. She helped Zeus to keep his throne. When Hephaestus was cast out of Mount Olympus, she hid him in a cave and helped to nurture him back to health. But she was so beautiful that she was bound to attract the attention of the gods. And she did. Both Zeus and Poseidon desired her. And the brothers probably would have come to conflict over her until something happened that turned their desire into trepidation. Themis, who gave order to all the men and the gods, delivered a prophecy that Thetis would bear a son who would be more powerful than his father. And go on to talk about the marriage of Peleus and Thetis, Eris and the apple, of course, the birth of Achilles, and then the divinity that had been stolen from him in the story. So I've found that story is effective in setting up student understanding of Achilles. So students have a hard time viewing Achilles as a hero. I don't think actually we're supposed to relate to Achilles like on a human. I don't think, oh yeah, I want to say that. I don't think it's as important that we relate to Achilles as a person, right? That's not I think we relate to him in our shared humanity with him, right? He feels his mortality more than we do, more than we could, because he was robbed of divinity. But I don't think approaching Achilles as like he's like your older brother in college's age friend, and you're gonna like relate to him on a personal level. I don't see that as, it hasn't worked from what I've seen. So you need to look at who Achilles is and his motivation for what he does to try to have some kind of understanding of him instead of just dismissing him as, this mopey guy down by the ships. So that story, and then of course, because the Iliad is the Iliad and it's amazing, Thetis keeps coming up. And because now my students have probably told more poorly than any ancient rhapsode could have told it, their version in their head of the story of Peleus and Thetis and their marriage, against her will, of course, and the birth of Achilles. Then when there are these little snapshots, these little summaries of myths that are outside the Iliad, but directly relate to the action in it, they get it, right? When Thetis goes to Hephaestus and has him make the armor, oh yeah, because she saved him once, right? He has this relationship with her. She protected him. So, I mean, we're reading the Iliad. We do read some of it out loud. We don't have access to, I love how Emily Wilson performs the Iliad. It's the closest thing probably we have to how it was originally performed. But that is like the story, right? And the story that has stacked in it all these other stories you can expand out. So that's how I've handled it with the high schoolers. As far as my integrated humanities literature course goes. For the 7th graders and 8th graders with the humanities class, I've kind of developed a timeline of things that really grab their attention. One of my favorite classroom exchanges was when I was telling my students about Hannibal crossing the Alps, right? When the Second Punic War to invade Italy. And I just kind of fell into, not meaning to, telling the event as a story, right? It excites me. It's exciting. It's fun to tell. So I just fell into it. and I didn't read an account of it. I just told them about it happening. And one of the seventh grade girls interrupted me and cried out, Mrs. Palmer, did that really happen? This was a student who was not a super history student, right? You have some students who you know are probably going to read books about the Civil War or submarines for the rest of their life, right? They are like history people. But she wasn't a history person. And she kept talking about Hannibal crossing the Alps with the elephants all spring. And about the same time, Smithsonian came out with a big article about Hannibal crossing the Alps, and there was a great graphic inside, and it was about testing for elephant DNA in the Alps. And I could get that out and say, here it is. Yes, it really happened. We just don't know which way they came, right? And how many elephants was up for debate, and should he have done it? Because, oh gosh, look at how many elephants made it into Italy. That was terrible. Big attrition rate. Not probably a good idea. She would talk about this for the rest of the semester. So that incident really stuck with her, and it really stuck with me, to the point that it became my goal to teach in such a way that students ask, did that really happen? And when students ask that question, then the subject instills wonder, right? Which is a concept that's become part of an educational catchphrase. I don't want, it's like wonder is the goal of education. And the more we say it, it's kind of, I don't know how more effective it is. But yes, we should wonder at the classical world. It's worthy of wonder. It contains a wide variety of events that seem to defy natural or human limitations, especially our perceptions of their limitations. When we talk about Heron and his inventions, the kids will say, wow, he did all that without electricity, without fossil fuels. They say, but yes, he didn't have that limitation put on him, right? That's something we're viewing him through. And the classical world continues to upend our preconceptions about the capabilities of ancient peoples, what they could do, how they could do it. So when I began, as I wrote my book, which I'll talk about in a little bit, I began to query agents in the Bay Area, and I found that most for young adults were really more interested in fantasy. Ancient historical fiction, not so much around. If you go to a bookstore, you probably won't see very much of it at all for young readers. I mean, that's fine. Fantasy has its place, but there are events in history that even fantasy can't imagine, or that we think belong more properly to the realm of fantasy. And here's the thing, these events really happened with humans here, right? And that in the classical humanities is our not so secret weapon in the way we present the stories we tell. We have the stories, right? And it's hard to resist a good story. I know adults who will say classic, so no, like it's not. They'll say, even more so than students, it's not relevant. It's not, but I recently witnessed Emily Wilson performing some of the Iliad, and those same adults are like, tell me more, right? Because, who can resist a story? So it's also enjoyable to tell a story. And it's important for teachers who love what they do, but are also often tired, right? We teach many students, we have many classes, but something happens when you tell a story about a subject you enjoy. You get energy from the telling, and the more you get into the story, the more your students get into the story, the more enjoyment and energy you get from the telling, right? And you might even have students, you maybe not so many in junior high or high school, but you might even have students who aren't afraid to already be storytellers. They might naturally be storytellers. They might tell you stories about things like homework and stuff. And it's fun after you've told a story to have one of those yarn spinners retell the story at the beginning of the next class, like for review. So, the story of Peleus and Thetis's wedding, so who would like to tell that story for us, right? Maybe only one or two people will volunteer, but everyone else will support them or say, wait, you left about this part, right? So the point is they're all following the storyteller still, even if they don't want to be the one to tell the story, right? So their classmates usually supply what details that the storyteller will leave out. So with younger students, so elementary students, you can ask them who would like to act out a scene, right? There's no problem with this, I'll tell you. Like if you say, who wants to act out a scene, you're going to get people who want to act it out. They'll sometimes act out the same scene as I read out loud. So let's say Alexander founding Alexandria. So who wants to act this out, right? You'll get all these hands up. Okay, well, you probably will have to end up reading or telling that story like 5 times because you'll have rounds of actors who want to act it out. So I want to be Bucephalus. Like, oh, I didn't get to be Bucephalus. Like you, okay, we'll do it again. And you can be Bucephalus that time, right? Okay. So they'll sometimes act out the same scene as I read it out loud or say it out loud, maybe 5 or 6 times with different actors. It depends on the story, right? So yeah, and then every time you tell it and they are physically involved in doing that story, you've got retention happening. And then you have people witnessing the story being told multiple times, but in slightly different ways because the actors are acting it out in slightly different ways with varying degrees of hilarity. But they remember Alexander and Bucephalus, right? So, and it's interesting because I don't know how familiar people are with Maria Montessori herself or her methodology, but so she was one of the first female physicians in Italy, really early on. Her life is worth studying if you ever get a chance. And she developed her methodology through observation. And then later, as brain science progressed, they've been able to look at what is going on in a toddler brain, what is going on in a 3 to 6-year-old brain, what's going on in an elementary brain, and the adolescent brain, of course, which is really fascinating. Tons of literature on that now. She developed her materials based on what she observed. And it's amazing how much of that gets backed up later by the brain science when the brain science catches up to her. So it turns out that storytelling, we think it's just a good way to convey information, right? But it turns out that storytelling can help our students to not only retain information, but to develop their executive functioning. And I have a whole article that I can share later or a link by Michael Dorr. So he expands on this in a really fascinating article about executive functioning, which is also kind of a catchphrase now, right? Like we all know it's important. It is important for our students to develop. It's important as adults. Something that makes life harder if you don't have a good level of it. So Michael Dorr expands on this idea. There are 3 ways that he developed that storytelling helps with executive functioning. So it directly addresses, this is his quote, it directly addresses and encourages working memory. So working memory is, like you have a shopping list in your head, and you don't want to forget anything on it, right? So you keep repeating it to yourself, or you remember it in a variety of ways so that when you go to the store, if you haven't written that list down, you can remember what you wanted to buy. Cognitive flexibility. So cognitive, and this is a summary. I'm not, this isn't, there's far more to it than this, but cognitive flexibility, the ability to think about more than one idea at once, or the idea to think of 2 different ideas, thinking back and forth of them, thinking of one idea, then the other, and then going back to the first. And inhibition control. So you think, well, like inhibition control, that's not so much for the storyteller as for the story listener, right? If you want to hear a story, you have to keep quiet and you have to keep your hands to yourself. You have to keep your body still, right? And there's a motivation to do that because you want to hear the story, right? And you want to be a part of that experience. So like I said, I can share that link later. But as far as like how to integrate the stories into a history course or into a humanities course. So as I said earlier, I have a timeline of events. I mean, I have taught without a textbook. We decided early on, both the modern history teacher and me, I'm the ancient history teacher, that we just like throw out the textbook as far as a student resource, primary student resource. It's great for a reference, great as a reference for us, and it's great as a reference for our students. But to not like buy these textbooks and start on the first chapter and just go through them, right? A friend of mine was saying, it's interesting how many adults become interested in history and do things like read giant books on the Civil War, right? But they'll say history wasn't interesting in school. It just didn't. And my friend and I were joking. Yeah, you don't ever hear someone say, remember that 7th grade history textbook? It was awesome, right? It might be a way to convey information, but it doesn't lead to wonder. It doesn't lead to a delight in learning. It's funny. You think, well, it's easier, right? As we all are tired teachers. And yes and no, because those very same students I talked about who maybe like history but don't like this way of presenting it, or really don't like history at all. They're like, show me, right? I don't know if it's so easy to have that going on while you're trying to teach. So anyway, at our particular school, we're like, not going to use textbooks anymore. So developing resources of my own over, it's probably been 12 years. I have binders, binders of resources, my binders in my cabinet at school. But one thing I did develop is kind of what critical events in classical history do students latch onto generally, right? They draw students in, they lend themselves to being told as stories, either written ones that we read as a story, or stories I tell without a text. So for example, I would think, okay, well, students are really interested in Queen Boudica and the Battle of Watling Street, which is what we call it now, right? She is really interesting. We have the Osprey in our program, the Osprey Queen Boudica book. That's great if someone is studying her for their independent research project, but it's not like you wouldn't want to read the whole thing in class. It's so detailed. So Battle of Watling Street. Okay, and this is how I would go. I would look around for a resource that tells it as a story in a compelling way. I would not find that resource. And then I would write the resource. Okay, I've done this with the beginning of the Persian Wars. I've done this with now in book format with the Battle of Watling Street. So over the years, like, well, I guess I'm writing it myself. And then I would write it and either consult it before class to see how I was going to tell the story, or I would just read it, right? Sometimes you find that resource that someone has made that is a story format and it works and it's wonderful. And I have a few of those. I think I'll probably still use, one is Nathaniel Hawthorne's telling of Bacchus and Philemon, the miraculous pitcher, he calls it. It's a lovely story. It's a lovely version of that myth. I start my Greek humanities class off with that to talk about hospitality and its importance for the Greeks. And I can read that whole story broken up over 2 classes and I don't lose anyone. If they want, they can follow along. I have photocopies of it. So would anyone like to read along? Or if you just want to listen, you can just listen and you can doodle. Once again, if you're quiet, you're keeping your body to yourself, you can do either way. So I am thankful for that resource. We also read Mary Renault's Lion in the Gateway, right? I can always, and so we read that. It's a story version of Herodotus, right? I think that I always can supplement in there about the Persians, because she's retelling Herodotus, who has his own take on the Persians, right? And I have a PowerPoint on the Persians. We can talk about their culture, how they're the older culture, like how the Greeks are the new culture, right? And the Persians are the older one, and just different aspects of Persian culture that they don't get in that book. But there's a story, right? The cover art is also very compelling, especially, the students who's like the Battle of Thermopylae is the cover art. So they're like staring at that. Wow. So anyway, so I have found resources to help me tell history as a story, but a lot of times I've had to develop it on my own. Okay, but some of these events. So as I said, Thermopylae, that's definitely an event that draws students in. The assassination of Julius Caesar, which has, of course, been memorialized by a far better storyteller, playwright than I am. But we read Julius Caesar, the play, in junior high, and they are so into it. And we have the Archangel recording of Julius Caesar. And so listening to it, we act it out every couple years. It's just, you can always have Julius Caesar in the rotation. And the story of Spartacus, right? They love the story of Spartacus. And then the story of Masada, that's another one that really draws students in. I had an 8th grade boy who was like, I want more. And we found the Biblical Archaeology Review article, big article about Masada. It was a cover article. And I kind of wanted to take a picture, which we wouldn't do, right, of students as far as like, wouldn't share it with the world, but would have to get permission to share, of him sitting in an armchair reading Biblical Archaeology Review, reading about Masada. So interested in it, and the ramp and how it was built and everything. So that timeline includes Boudica and her resistance against the Romans. Adolescents love stories of resistance. They're interested in the Romans, but they're always like gunning for the underdog too, right? Like Spartacus and like Boudica. So when I started to write a timeline of my book, I began with the Battle of Watling Street, as we now call it. And then I looked around the Roman Empire in 61 CE and realized that, hey, Heron of Alexandria is most likely still alive. I think they estimate his life, and it's in the 1st century, maybe 70 is when he passes away. We're not quite sure. And Heron actually appears in the Keepers of Alexandria, but as a boy. So the Keepers of Alexandria imagines him, because we don't know a lot about Heron, you can make a backstory, right? That he is Greek, that he's from Alexandria. We know these things, that he invented these machines. The Keepers of Alexandria imagines him as a boy. He's like an orphan who is shipwrecked. And he has this like almost magical gift to make machines from a young age. So my students were familiar with him, but not like the historical Heron who made machines as an adult in Alexandria. So I took a thread of a story of a boy from Britain. His name is Phelan. He's fictionalized, who survived the Battle of Watling Street and is sold into slavery. And then I took another thread of the story from the other end of the empire, right? That of Heron and his inventions, and wound these threads together in a story. It's a bad situation from the start for Phelan, for the character in my book. Once he's sold into slavery, but at a certain point, Phelan's master takes him and a few other of his household slaves to Alexandria for business. And once they arrive, Phelan manages to escape. He happens upon Heron, and Heron has to make a choice whether he's going to turn Phelan in, since Phelan is a runaway slave, or whether he's going to give him shelter and a chance to live, because Phelan won't live if he's returned to his owner. He's already run away once, and this is twice, and he has a slave collar and everything. So it's then that Phelan, who is interested in machines, he witnesses when they go to Ostia, the human-powered cranes at the port. And it's at that point that he becomes Heron decides he's going to shelter him, and he becomes his kind of apprentice. I don't want to give away the whole story, but Phelan has to hide his real appearance and always has to evade capture, even in a city the size of Alexandria, because of the status and wealth of the man who claims ownership of him. So that's kind of the background of how I came to develop the story and the kind of a snapshot of the plot. And let's conclude by just imagining Alexandria in the 60s, right? The time that this is set. It had its challenges, especially as the decade progressed. The social unrest there between the Greeks and the Jews, the native Egyptians, and the Romans, who are supposed to maintain order over all of them, is going to explode into violence in the streets. With the Ptolemies gone, once the Romans replaced them, investment in the intellectual life of the city was not what it used to be. Even during the Ptolemies' reign, later Ptolemies' reign, they could not invest what they used to in the library and the museum, because they had to deal with these social problems. But people still came to Alexandria, even with the Romans in power, because of the opportunities for trade and learning that abounded there. Founded for founded by Alexander the Great. For hundreds of years, the city had been independently ruled by the Ptolemies, who poured resources into making Alexandria into an intellectual center of the world. Alexandria is also home to the youngest of the seven wonders, the lighthouse. It was about 450 feet tall and a literal and figurative beacon for the Mediterranean world, providing light to sailors trying to navigate the perilous North African coast and knowledge to minds seeking enlightenment. It cast its light at least 37 miles out to sea in the same distance into the desert, drawing caravans from the east. Once a ship entered Alexandria's public harbor, you probably all know this about the books, right? The harbor of Happy Return, Alexandrian harbor officials boarded it in search of books. If they found a text that did not already exist in the library, then the owner would have to wait to receive it back until a copy was made. The library held hundreds of thousands of scrolls. It was the goal of the Ptolemies that it contained all human learning and knowledge, and that scholars from the world come there to access it. It entered into fierce rivalries with other libraries, Pergamum for one, and each city recruited librarians, some of whom became famous in their own right. These librarians pioneered fundamental tools that we take for granted today when we research: alphabetical listing of authors and libraries, the index, the glossary, and the commentary. Joined to the library was the Museon, a kind of research center that contained a zoo and a botanical garden. Scholars lived and worked near the Museon, received high salaries, and paid no taxes. And they accessed the library when they needed to. And what kind of innovations did they create there? Herophilus performed the first anatomy studies on human cadavers. Euclid and Diophantus, the ancient father of algebra, lived and worked there, and theories of both a sun-centered and an earth-centered solar system were proposed in Alexandria. And then there was Heron. He wasn't the only famous inventor in the ancient world, but in Alexandria, he was known as the Machine Man. His creations include the vending machine, an automatic theater, and the steam turbine. The theater is considered one of the first examples of a computer program. In a rectangular box mounted on a column, scenes from mythology would play out mechanically with little figures coming onto each scene and exiting it. Each scene was controlled by a central dowel with a rope wound around it and around pegs that were driven into it. Every peg represented the beginning of a different scene, a different command. When people read my book, even adults, they sometimes ask me if I made up the part about Heron's machines, and I wish I had that kind of imagination. I know it really happened. I can get lost in ancient history, especially in a place like Alexandria, because it really did happen. Other authors excel at world building, but I suppose I enjoy world rebuilding more. Because what a shame if people were to not know about Alexandria. This became my anthem as I wrote, and it still motivates me as I write and teach today. I did find a home for my book with a publisher in San Francisco. Then I worked on drafts, of course, right? I especially remember editing one draft in a hotel room while we were evacuated during the glass fire in October 2020. We've had some problems with fires in the Bay Area in Napa County. So we were evacuated along with everyone else we knew, right? And I found that time, I just remember getting up early because I couldn't sleep. We thought our house would burn down. And I had to edit, and it was a consolation. I could escape the uncertainty and smoke to learn about and contemplate a world that wasn't without problems, but could help me find new ways of looking at our own. This really became one of the central themes in Phelan and the Miracle Machines. Education can be a consolation, both while it's being acquired and as you reflect on it in the decades that follow. The classical world is so far removed from our own. And while others might offhandedly say that it makes the ancient world irrelevant, I see the study of it as a tremendous opportunity to escape our polarized, claustrophobic news cycle, right? There's also the natural human feeling that whatever we're going through at this point in our history is the most important, right? Livy has a bit to say about this. And so why study ancient history then? When we remove ourselves from the equation by turning our attention to ancient history, we gain all kinds of space for observation and reflection. We find that perhaps there are other important times, even more important times, and that the future has always been full of terrible things and wonderful, amazing things. While we can't predict the future, we can see how sequences of events can play out. We can know what kinds of events can lead to other kinds of events. Historical fiction brings all of these events to life through storytelling. The ancient Alexandrians turned to the pursuit of knowledge to help them when they were faced with the unknown, and they persevered until they achieved their end. They also preserved the learning of the world with great care and were dedicated to cataloging and organizing the texts that they acquired. Their endeavors drew others to the city, making the lighthouse a most appropriate choice to represent Alexandria's importance in the life of the world and the life of the mind. It was a fabulous place, a place of stories, and it really happened. So thank you.
Thank you so much,
Oh, sure.
Abigail. So we do still have some time for questions. If you'd like to ask a question, you can use the raise hand feature. Mary Ann. Uh,
Yes, thank you for your talk. I was curious about your practice of having students act out stories or retell stories. How much of this is done in your Latin language classes in Latin?
Sure. So when we read Latin novellas, let's say, I'll give an example. So Ego Polyphemus, that's a very popular, fun Latin novella. So as with the humanities class, we might summarize at the beginning of class. I think that if I give students, if they have kind of key Latin vocabulary that keeps reappearing over and over. So in Ego Polyphemus, it might be Saxum, rock, right? Because he's always going back to his cave and rolling the rock aside. So I think for first year students, it's pretty challenging for them to summarize in Latin, but I could say, can you tell me a Latin word that describes Polyphemus, right? Can you tell me a Latin word that describes Galatea, right? What is she? Oh, she's a nympha, right? So I can ask leading questions to help them retain the story. They can always summarize in English, but if, like you said, if you're looking for like Latin vocabulary acquisition, I think I can still ask them some leading questions. We still will summarize in English at the beginning of the next class. So like, okay, what did we see? So Polyphemus wrote his first poem to Galatea. How did that go? Right? And they can summarize it. So something that in that particular Latin novella is fun is the author, he kind of plays on Catullus in there, where Polyphemus is sad because Galatea rejects him. So he goes back and he's like eating people, like eating, Odysseus's men. And he's like making poetry about it based on Catullus. So students could always memorize that. They'll often find that part in the book and they'll read it again. So I think telling stories with the book accessible also is helpful. They'll be like, wait, I got to find the page, right? They also find it hilarious that Polyphemus is upset that Galatea has a human lover because the human lover has two eyes. And that's like, oh, he has duos oculos. My students will just like, oh, that's so funny. That's hilarious, right? And so I could say, if they are having trouble recalling the words, say, what does Polyphemus have? Unum, right? This is just, I could develop it much more. This is just kind of on my own how I've integrated it into our Latin class. So yeah, hope that is helpful answer.
Thank you.
Sure.
I think we have time for one or two more questions if anyone else wants to ask one. I guess otherwise, yeah.
Yeah,
We're almost at the hour mark, so
great. Yeah.
thank you everyone for coming. And thanks again, Abigail.
Thank you. Thanks for hosting. I really appreciate it.
Have a great day, everyone.
You too. Thanks. Bye.